cause standard ought to apply to searches of students. Our sole point of contention is that the cure is worse than the disease. Right now, searches are used as a main tool for crime deterrence in schools, but the probable cause standard changes that. As Northwestern University's Tanja Jacoby explains in 2013, as officials conduct fewer searches due to heightened standards, there's a lower perceived likelihood that crime will be resolved. Emory University's Hugo Milon concurs, finding that under stronger Fourth Amendment standards, more searches will likely be ruled unconstitutional, resulting in a perceptual increase in crime. As the National Institute of Justice explains, the most common approach to deterring crime is to increase the perceptual certainty that criminals will be caught. Thus, in order to compensate for the perceived crime increase that comes as a result of implementing the probable cause standard, two approaches will be adopted by policymakers, school officials, and law enforcement. The first is drug dogs. Currently, drug dogs are not very prevalent in schools, but that would change under the probable cause standard. As Benjamin Tiller of the St. Louis Law Review writes, the reduced chance of being caught as a result of the higher standard would tempt kids to bring more contraband. My computer's like not working, so
yeah, that's okay.
Schools would increase the use of drug dogs. Kate Ellenberger of the EPI agrees, finding that the right of school officials to use narcotic canines is well established. Even more so, James Shadid, Chief Justice of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, ruled last summer that even though they are inaccurate, an alert from a dog triggers a constitutional search. This becomes problematic as discriminatory beliefs of dog handlers often reflect onto the dogs themselves, causing false positives. Lisa Litt of the Animal Cognition Journal found in 2011 that the overwhelming majority of false alerts were caused by handlers signaling the dog when to alert, demonstrating how discriminatory beliefs seep their way into the justice system. Empirical confirmation of this phenomenon comes from Joe Marr of the University of Chicago, who found in a 3-year analysis that while only 44% of alerts by dogs led to the discovery of drugs, that figure dropped to 27% when looking at Hispanics. Additionally, Jason Nance of the University of Florida quantifies that general searches such as drug dog sweeps are 7.7 times more likely to be used in schools with higher minority populations. While the adoption of drug dogs in schools simply allows for a continuation of the status quo in the context of racial discrimination, it also garners a unique negative impact. As Bradley Snyder of the University of Washington writes, the usage of dogs in schools often exacerbates educational disparities between minority and non-minority students, as well as increasing overall dropout rates. Thus, a decrease in searches causes an increase in the perception of crime, which officials would respond to by deploying drug dogs, which are disproportionately and incorrectly used against students of color. The second is zero-tolerance policies. The ACLU's Dennis Parker explains that zero-tolerance policies mandate certain harsh punishments for offenses regardless of the circumstances. Daniel Lowson of American University finds historically that a fear of increased violence during the 1990s led school districts throughout the country to promote zero-tolerance policies. The increased perception of crime that was seen 2 decades ago would be similarly replicated today with the implementation of the probable cause standard, causing a proportional increase in the usage of zero-tolerance policies. Zero-tolerance policies are harmful to youth, however, as they end up resulting in higher incarceration rates for offenses that would normally have been handled with detention or low-level punishment in previous years. As the National Center for Education Statistics reveals, suspension and expulsion rates have doubled since the implementation of zero-tolerance measures, with students of color being 3.5 times more likely to be expelled than non-minority students. Luckily, the juvenile justice, because an affirmative ballot takes 1 step forward but 2 steps back, Ardrey Kell indicates.
Because the time for progress is always now, Kevin and I affirm. Contention 1 is fostering a better environment. Probable cause reduces unfair searches of students because more evidence is needed in order to justify the search. Devilish Rutledge of Police Magazine explains, probable cause requires more information to lead to a search compared to the reasonable suspicion standard, which is currently used in schools. Thus, schools will be unable to legally justify many wrongful searches. Hugo Milan of Emory University finds empirically that the standard to get a warrant is below a certain point and that it is increased, it reduces searches. Reducing unjust searches helps to foster a positive atmosphere in schools as students perceive school staff as fair and trusting. As students feel they're being treated unfairly, they're more likely to engage in delinquency because they have fewer positive bonds with school staff who can support them during struggling times. Katie James of the University of Georgia finds that one unit increase in perceived teacher fairness is associated with a 47% reduction in a student's odds of fighting at school and a 48% reduction in a student's odds of bringing a weapon to school. Trust in teachers is critical in order to maintain safety at schools. Contention 2 is dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. Schools are increasingly beginning to resemble prisons as students face harsh discipline and are treated like convicts. Sarah Foreman of the University of Detroit explains the narrative of youth criminalization casts students as dangerous troublemakers. Reinstating the probable cause standard sparks national change by shifting this narrative in two ways. First, legitimizing the call for student rights. Passing a policy aligned with the viewpoint of these movements for change sends a powerful message that the groups calling for reform are not just some radical organization, but instead one that has garnered official support. Carrie Congolese of the University of Pennsylvania writes, actions by legal institutions can lend legitimacy to claims of social movements. Both people in the media are more likely to discuss prominent national movements than cause a scene as disorganized or radical. This is critical, as right now it seems very few people know about the issues at hand. Esther Sapita of the Washington Post explains, a recent poll seems to imply that the general public does not understand and has maybe never heard of the school-to-prison pipeline. Having the general public know about the issue at hand is a prerequisite to national reform. Second is by bringing rationality back to the discussion. Fear-mongering currently saturates the debate on school policy. Heather Thompson of the University of Michigan explains, even the nation's poorest inner-city parents, those who object strongly to district-level measures that criminalize their students, fret mightily about the issue of school safety, as our assertions about a newly violent youth rest on a non-scientific evidentiary foundation, as does our belief that the public schools are now more violent than ever. The probable cause standard that would strike down New Jersey versus TLO, the Supreme Court decision that waived the standard in the first place, can combat this issue. Eric Madfis of the University of Washington furthers, there is much to gain by advancing in a rational conversation about school dangers, demonstrating the rarity of such events and the lack of empirical evidence indicating the success of enhanced security. The action by courts in the affirmative world provides the rational discourse, as David Magic of UC Santa Barbara writes, not only by deciding cases, but also delivering reasons for its decisions. The court articulates through lawmakers the public what will and will not be acceptable in similar cases in the future. Moreover, even if the case did not go to the courts, the public would still learn about the issue as the media exposes the government's policy and decision-making calculus. Don Fisher of Itasca University explained, for example, the media gives citizens information for effective political participation and on government accomplishments. Legal institutions pushing forth a rational discourse on the issue is the only way to inspire lawmakers to stop unfair measures that criminalize students. The impact of stopping criminalization policies in these ways is reducing incarceration. Sarah Mims of the Atlantic expresses the impact of reforming the system, writing, the United States sends 2 million children through the juvenile detention system every year, 95% of whom have not committed a single violent crime. Thus, we affirm.
We're going to take a few seconds before cross. That was 11 seconds. Great.
Everybody ready?
All right. Let's talk about your second intention.
Sure.
And about creating rationality and legitimizing policy.
Yes.
What is the case of Birchfield v. North Dakota?
So you're going to tell me?
I'm not, because I don't know. All I know is a Fourth Amendment case. And
Okay.
the problem with that is that no one knows anything about it because
Yeah.
no one cared about
So
it.
like, if a case were to overturn something like probable cause, I guarantee you the entire world would know, due to the fact that like 2 million students go into the juvenile
Did you
detention
know?
system
Did you
every
know what
single
reasonable
year.
suspicion was before you started
No,
searching this
the
up?
discourse doesn't exist right now, and that's why we need to overturn the precedent to create such
Okay.
positive discourse. But
But
can I ask you a question?
if
Can
people
I
don't
ask you a
care-
question really quickly?
Really quickly,
It's
if
not that
people
people
don't care in
don't
the
care.
first place-
It's not that people don't care. It's that people don't know. But can I
If
ask
people
you a
don't care
question
in the
really
first
quickly?
place, they're
It's
very
not
unlikely
that
to learn
people
about it in the
don't
future.
care. It's
Go
not
ahead.
that people don't care. It's people don't know. That's why we expose them. So let me ask you a question really quickly. So you talk about how there will be increased zero tolerance policies when you affirm.
Yeah.
Isn't there already zero tolerance policies in place like all over the country?
Yeah, but they would increase more. Like,
Wait,
they
how do
would-
you increase something that already exists?
Like, all right, so maybe there's like certain policies for certain like offenses. We're saying that they would expand that.
Yeah, like the trend right now is towards criminalization. Like right now we have like marijuana zero tolerance policies. We have like gun zero tolerance policies. We have like you disrupt the school
You
classroom,
could ramp
you get
that
a zero
effort
tolerance
up.
policy.
We would say that rate of increase would go
But like
even higher.
no, but the thing is they already exist. So like, how much more will they exist? So what other offenses are not covered under zero tolerance policies right now that would be covered with in the future?
Such as low-level offenses, such
Those
as like,
already are under zero tolerance
I mean,
policies.
you can apply
Like,
stricter
I
measures to
guarantee
them.
you, if I vandalized my school, I would automatically be suspended or
Sure,
expelled.
you can
But like,
always
I'm talking
increase the
about like,
severity of the punishment, and there are other offenses,
how
but
do
I'm going to
you
ask you a
increase
question
the
now.
severity of
So,
sending
on
someone
your
to
second-
prison?
on
Like,
your-
no, really quickly, before you ask me a question, how do you increase the severity of literally
All right,
putting
it's
someone in the
either,
criminal justice
it's
system?
either you either receive a longer suspension,
No,
or you
that's
receive a longer
not
sentence.
determined by anyone
But I
other
need to
than
ask
the
you-
judge. So zero tolerance policies don't determine
That's actually
like
really
how
bad.
long
Alright.
they actually end up in the
Let's
criminal
talk about,
justice
let's
system.
talk
The
about
judge
your
does.
second warrant about rationality.
Sure.
What do people who don't get their information from the media, how will they learn about this?
Where do you get your information from?
Nothing. I mean, like, I get my information from the media. Like, people
Who
who
doesn't
don't.
get their information from the media?
I mean, there's some people.
Like who? Like Sam?
Yeah, Sam.
Where does Sam get his information from?
That's a question for Sam, not for
Where are they getting information from if it's not coming from the media?
I mean,
Like
I'm not.
debate rounds? Like, is this where everybody like learns about debate
Alright,
right
there are
here?
some
Or do they
people-
like go home and research?
There are some people who don't get all their information from the media.
Where do they get their information?
I'm not like 100% sure where they all get their information from, but like Sam's gonna
They
talk
just
about.
like live out in the wilderness and like don't like participate in society. Those are the people you're talking about, right?
Sure.
So like, why do they even matter in a debate round?
Alright, like it's not just those people, but people
Like,
who don't
who
get
else?
information
Like,
from
I
the
really
media-
wanna know
People
who-
who don't care about these issues won't learn about these issues.
But like, who doesn't care about their child getting sent into the criminal
Because
justice
not
system?
everyone has children. That's an unfair assumption.
Yeah, and I would say like this overwhelming majority of parents probably give a crap about things like the school of prison pipeline. Or at least if they do.
Jay cares about his children.
Proton?
So for my judges, it's going to be
Wait, what?
or all my judges.
Yes.
Agreed.
Before I get into my opponent's case, let's start with a quick overview. Michael Piner, law professor at the University of Maryland, conducted an analysis on federal cases involving school searches, finding that in order for the probable cause to be the standard in schools, a law enforcement officer must initiate the search and be actively involved in it. This means that in the affirmative world, we would see an increase in law enforcement presence at schools as the courts would require it. This is incredibly problematic, however, because Jason Nance at the University of Florida finds that a student who is in contact with an officer at school is 1.83 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement for low-level offenses that would have been handled with a detention had the officer not been there. The next step after being arrested is to appear in court. There's a slight difference between juvenile court and regular court, and that arises from a 1971 Supreme Court ruling where it was established that a trial by jury is a right only adults have. So juvenile hearings are decided by one sole judge. Unfortunately, this increases the room for biases to seep into decision-making, as the National Council on Crime and Delinquency analyzed 25 years worth of national data and found that if 3 juveniles with no prior referrals to court were to commit identical crimes, an African American is 6 times more likely to be sent to prison, and a Latino is 3 times more likely to be sent to prison than their white equivalent. This systemic flaw in the juvenile court system is the true reason why racial disparities in incarceration rates exist today, and it never goes addressed by an affirmative ballot, and objectively gets worsened by SRO presence. But let's go down their case. First, on environment. What you need to recognize is everything in this contention is about the problems with the legal standard of reasonable suspicion. Ideally, you would think under an affirmative ballot that standard would go away, but it doesn't. There's a loophole called stop and frisk. As Cornell's Legal Information Institute explains, stop and frisk searches were created as an exception to the probable cause standard, and all you need is reasonable suspicion. This is corroborated by Michelle Alexander of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who writes, so long as police officers have reasonable suspicion that someone is engaged in criminal activity, it is constitutionally permissible to stop and frisk him or her, even in the absence of probable cause. This means that all the rights infringements, all the racism that's going on right now as a result of the low standard simply continues under a different name. But there is a new harm. That comes from Henry Fridella of Arizona State University, who writes 2 things. First, 85% of those who are stopped and frisked are either black or Latino. Second, getting stopped and frisked increases your log odds of having lethal force used against you by 90% and non-lethal force being used against you by 1,089%. This means that everything that's going on right now simply continues. Plus, there is a new net harm of risking minority lives. They then cite Mylon, who's also our author. Remember what we tell you is when searches decrease, you increase the perception of violence. Therefore, they can't indict this as it's their only link into their first detention. Second, on James, there's 3 problems with it. It's their only impact. First, the sample size is male and white. And second, James finds that the inelasticity of trust makes it incredibly hard to increase it across the bright line to trigger their impact. Next, on the school to prison pipeline, they have two warrants. The first is that we call for rights and we help social movements by this ruling. Two responses. First, Globin of the University of Virgin finds that liberal movements actually suffer from Supreme Court victories because it seems like a judicial handout. Second, what Stephen Carter of Yale University finds is due to a lack of interest, court victories empirically generate no change in social movements. We don't actually see any benefit arise from this as far as society is concerned. Second, on rationality, recognize Danny concedes in First Crossfire that the only link into this is media perception because that's the only way that people get their information. There's two problems with this. First, on Kimberly Twist of UC Berkeley finds that there's a two-pronged analysis for influencing Americans' views. First, we expect national opinion to change significantly only when two conditions hold true. The court must issue a ruling on a politically controversial issue, and the media must offer one-sided coverage. If they can't show you that both those things happen, we don't change people's perceptions. Then, what Johnson of the American Political Science Review finds is that when SCOTUS overturns a previous ruling, it undermines its legitimacy in the eyes of the people. We're seeing that when we go back and we overturn TLO, all this stuff about discourse happening doesn't happen because people no longer view the Supreme Court as a reliable political actor. Then on incarceration, recognize they tell you themselves 95% of the people who are in juvenile detention centers are for nonviolent cases. That's exactly what we're telling you will happen under an affirmative world because Nance tells you that those low-level crimes get even more criminalized under an affirmative ballot. Thus, because we send more children from the school to prison pipeline in an affirmative world, I urge you to join the negative.
We're gonna run first. Okay. I believe that was 38 more seconds, which would be 49 used to. Is everyone ready?
Starting on their first contention, they say that all of their arguments are about reactionary policies that will happen after you affirm. It's important that we understand what causes these reactionary policies, like zero tolerance and drug dogs, to be used in the first place. The reason schools use this is because they have this irrational fear of things like school shootings or things like school violence. That changes when you affirm. That's our second contention, where we say we're bringing rationality back to the discussion. The prerequisite to everything they say is so bad in their case is solved in the long term when you vote for the affirmative. Then they try and tell you, like, first and foremost about drug dogs. There's a couple of problems here. The biggest difference between searching with a drug dog and searching a student directly, they tell you, is like drug dogs are really racist because their owners signal them in a racist fashion. I think it would be a lot easier for a directly racist cop to create racism when they're searching someone directly, as opposed to if they're going through the dog. Like, if anything, you're only going to have a net positive impact. This doesn't really garner them any offense. It's just still saying that there's still going to be some racist searches. Then you look to their argument on zero tolerance policy. There's a few problems here. First and foremost, they don't show you any uniqueness. We argue, as Danny says in Crossfire, that right now the situation is getting a lot worse in terms of criminalization, so harsher punishments are most likely on the way. Danny gives you the MSNBC analysis that says the Obama administration has increased funding for school resource officers, so that's showing you that the situation is only getting worse. But second of all, zero tolerance policies are not as big a deal as they make them out to be. Cunningham of University of Maryland explains that most schools don't have other sorts of. Most schools where there's a racial gap and expulsions and suspensions, the gap is much bigger for crimes not covered under zero tolerance policies. That being said, it's clear it's not like a piecemeal issue we're dealing with. We're dealing with a general trend of criminalization, and whoever gets to the root of that brings into all of the racism impacts they're talking about. That being said, go to Danny and my case. Start on their overview. They tell you school resource officers goes up. There's a couple of problems. First, a rational discourse solved. Insofar as they tell you themselves school resource officers contribute to the school to prison pipeline, by creating this rational discourse, that means there might be a short-term increase in school resource officers, but in the long term we're solving back for it. The second problem is, remember, school resource officers are on the increasing trend right now, as MSNBC tells you funding for them is going up. UNC furthers that the main reason a school gets a school resource officer is to search students in the first place.
That being said, it is very clear that these school resource officers are going to be searching more and more students if we let the trend continue. But they tell you themselves with the Milan evidence that searches go down, or at least are a little bit more restrictive. So if anything now, school resource officers, when you affirm, have less of an ability to search students and less of an ability to contribute to the school to prison pipeline. Then, onto our first contention, they try and say that there's going to be loopholes through things like stop and frisk. But remember, all of this comes from a misunderstanding that these policies do so much more harm than good, so in the long term, a rational discourse falls back. That's the most important issue in the round. That being said, go to Danny and my second contention. Go to our second link. Their first response is that the media perception is really important, and they tell you that Twist says two things must be met. First and foremost, Danny and I are meeting these two factors. First, they say that we have to show that the court is going to First, they tell you that we must show that the issue is controversial. We would argue that the issue of 2 million students, 95% of whom are not violent, going to prison every single year would be very controversial once the facts get out there. Then they try and tell you we must show that it's a one-sided media coverage. The Opportunity Project looks at 200 media outlets and finds that coverage of youth in the criminal justice system is largely sympathetic. Obviously, no issue ever has 100% coverage for them, but we're showing you that it is going to be favored towards the movement once we spark this discourse. That being said, they also tell you that overturning Supreme Court decisions delegitimizes them. First, the Supreme Court overturns decisions all the time, so that it's non-unique. Like, the Supreme Court would have no legitimacy then. But second of all, we tell you it doesn't have to be by the Supreme Court, as Fisher tells you that the media reports on all government policies, and obviously the government gives their justification and their decision-making calculus to the public.
Wait, what? This is pretty good. Oh, you're right. Yeah. Everybody ready? So why would only a rational discourse tell us that this ruling happens and then we only view it in a positive light?
Yeah, that's the argument we're making. We're saying that we agreed that the information disseminates through the media, right?
Yeah.
And we show you that media coverage is largely sympathetic in the status quo in the criminal justice system.
But what you also have to keep in mind is it kind of ties back more into the controversial. Is people have to care about this, right?
Okay, so if I told you, Sam, that 2 million kids are being thrown in prison every year for nonviolent crimes, do you care?
Yeah, I care, but that's not what the coverage is going to be about, right?
Wait, why not? We just told you that the media is very open to this issue, so obviously the coverage is going to be skewed in a way that makes people care.
Yeah, but Bill O'Reilly doesn't do public forum debate, right? He's not going to see this decision and be like, oh my God, this must impact the school to prison pipeline. Exactly. He's going to go on the night of the news and be like, oh, and by the way, today, the Supreme Court decided to give probable cause.
Does your twist evidence say that the Supreme Court has never helped spread discourse on an issue?
No. What it says is that two things have to be met. It has to be a politically controversial issue, which Stephen Carter of Yale University.
But has it ever helped? Has it ever helped?
For what?
Spread discourse on an issue.
I mean, I would say Brown versus Board of Education.
Sure. And do you think the media coverage was all in favor of Brown v. Board of Education? There was probably
radio, there wasn't a whole lot of
that's just not true. There's newspapers, Sam.
Yeah, sure.
That's the thing. So what we're saying is there's never going to be any absolute media coverage, so we should look to a trend, right?
Yeah, no, but what
so
I tried to tell you earlier.
Yeah.
Stephen Carter is University. People in the context of media are especially disinterested in criminal justice issues when it comes to.
Wait, is that a general piece of statement? Because we're telling you right now in the context of the media, looking at 200 different media stories they found. That right now the media is reporting on.
So the media can put out whatever it wants, but what matters
but you're saying people don't care.
Yeah,
people don't care about criminals in general. I would agree with that.
The Supreme Court rulings on criminal justice.
That's fine.
What this is.
Do you think they care about kids?
Change the channel.
Do you think they care about kids?
I mean, no.
That's just not true. Like, parents and people freak out whenever our kids are like either in danger or being treated poorly. Like, the kids part is what makes it a compelling story. And that's literally why it says like media coverage right now towards kids in the criminal justice system is super
At the
sympathetic.
end of the day, like, this isn't something news outlets are interested in projecting or people are interested in receiving. Like, that's like empirically true. Is it like
that doesn't
the
make
media
any
doesn't
sense.
the media doesn't project Supreme Court rulings about criminal justice
That's just
because
not
no
true.
one's on the receiving
Like,
end.
in the past they haven't done that, but we tell you like right now, that's what the media is like focusing on. That's like the big media.
Did we see any of this happen after the New Jersey versus TLO?
Yeah, Daniel bring up evidence in summary from Heitzig that tells you after New Jersey v. TLO, the media publicized a lot of commentary that led to criminalizing policy. Clearly, people pay attention to what happens in schools.
Is everyone ready? I'm starting on the top of my list. Starting off the top of the case, we give you the links from Jacoby and Milan that tells you that less searches is lead to an increased perception of crime because there's a lower likelihood that contraband will be caught. That's the perception of lawmakers. He responds by saying there's rationality. If we bring rationality back to the discussion, then the perception of crime won't exist anymore. That higher perception of crime won't exist anymore. We realize Sam responds to this rationality argument. First, he gives you the Carter analysis, says that there's no change in social movements because literally no one cared. I asked him what Birchfield versus North Dakota meant. It was a Fourth Amendment case. He didn't know. Moreover, no one in this room, I'm willing to put money on that, knew what reasonable suspicion was before this topic came out. So at that point, we're like very educated people. If we're unlikely to know it, a lot of other people are unlikely to know it as well. But then let's talk about drug docs. He puts one response on this. First, he says direct searches are more racist. However, realize it's a general search that triggers more individual racist searches like they tell you. Realize that there's several false positives that occur. That's the lit analysis, and that's extremely racist because they tell their animal when to signal. That's why Marr finds that the rate in Chicago of drug dog searches, that was actually racist towards Hispanics. But then Nance tells you that there's a 7.7 times increase in the likelihood of a search in a minority school than in a non-minority school of a general search, such as a drug dog sweep. And that's why Snyder finds that it exacerbates the racial inequality. Even if you believe searches goes down, all these reactionary policies only make it get worse. But then let's talk about SROs. Because Piner tells you that the courts say that law enforcement must initiate a search. Nance tells you that this results in a 1.8 times increase in the referment to law enforcement. He tries to tell you that SROs can't do searches. That's not our argument. Our argument is that SROs will criminalize low-level offenses. Then he talks about the idea of rational discourse. Realize we respond to that below. Then on stop and frisk, realize it's an exception to the probable cause requirement, and they use it when they fear for their safety, and it's more likely to be invoked under probable cause. Verdella tells us that 85% of the people who are subject to that are people of color, and as a result, they're 1,100% more likely to have force used against them. Just because you eliminate the harmful searches that they talk about doesn't mean more harmful policies won't come in its place. Then on the twist issue, realize it has to be politically controversial. It's not. Literally, no one knows about it. It has to be one-sided. They don't ever prove to you that the media coverage is one-sided.
Okay.
We're not.
Sorry, I have that as a minute 25 to go.
So I'm going to start out on the overview on their case and then do our case. Everybody ready? Remember, these general trends for SROs are going up. That's the MSM card that Kevin brings up in his rebuttal. They literally continue to drop that. Also, even if you don't buy that, remember, even if we have a risk of offense of winning rational discourse, that's really important because it fixes back the increase of SROs and all the criminalizing policies they talk about. We tell you the general trend is to increase criminalization. We are the only side in today's round that dismantles the school to prison pipeline. Now go ahead onto our second contention. We're going to be winning very clearly. First, in regards to our first contention, he tries to say that all these stop and frisk policies are just going to increase. Remember, that's just short-term, long-term. We saw even a risk of offense, you vote for us. Sorry, now let's go to our second contention. We're going to be winning our second contention, second link, extremely clearly. First, he brought this up in Crossfire, probably going to bring it up in Final Focus and make it seem like we didn't say it at all, but here's the issue. He says people just won't care about the issue. We tell you from the Heitzig evidence that the past in the media actually care about things like criminal justice reform. People do care about their children getting sent to jail. Then he brings up the twist evidence that says that it needs to be politically controversial and it needs one-sided coverage. Kevin responds to this very clearly in his rebuttal. Just go ahead and circle these pieces of evidence. First, 2 million children being put in the school to prison pipeline, I'd say that's pretty controversial, being put into prison. But then second of all, the Opportunity Project, specifically the children, says the coverage of youth criminalization is largely sympathetic. That means it's only going to get one-sided coverage, but even if it doesn't, we tell you just allowing individuals to know the problem persists is the way to solve backward. He says it's going to delegitimize social movements through a Supreme Court ruling. Whether it's a Supreme Court ruling or a legislative movement, that's really important because what it does is it allows for the information to get out. When people can learn that millions and millions of children are being forced into the criminal justice system, we're able to solve back for the issues of SROs. We're able to solve back for the issues like zero tolerance policies. We're able to solve back for the issues that are putting our children in prison. This is important because you extend the MIMS analysis that says 2 million children get sent to the criminal justice system every single year. 95% of whom have not committed a single violent crime. Let's create discourse. Let's create change. Let's affirm.
Is everyone ready for Brand?
Yeah. So why exactly does this case in particular get more media coverage than any other Fourth Amendment case has?
Sure. Like, this is what we've been saying repeatedly, right? Two factors are different here. First and foremost, well, I would say three factors, actually, sorry. The first factor is the scope of the issue. 2 million kids being put in prison every single year. 95, wait, can I answer? And then I promise to follow. The first thing is the 2 million kids. The second is the fact that it's children being arrested. People really care when it's children. And the third thing we tell you is we are in a unique situation where criminal justice reformers have the winds at their back by the media for the first time in decades, especially when we tell you coverage is largely sympathetic.
Okay, so hold on, let's just go down the three issues,
It's
right?
not that people don't care
wait,
about
just-
it, it's that people don't
No,
care.
no,
If you
like,
expose them to the truth, they'll begin to care. So
Okay,
can we move on to something
no.
else?
You just gave like 3 reasons, right?
To answer your
I
question,
know.
yes. If you have a
So-
question, feel free.
And it's literally back to the original question. Why have almost identical cases gotten no media coverage? You tell me because of the scope, 2 million kids. These past
aren't
cases apply to 300 million American citizens,
I'm
right?
telling you, it's children in schools. And like, Danny,
Okay, so
at
then
the end of the
kids,
day,
right?
Sam, at the end of the day, let me do a little bit of comparison. You're making this assertion that there's all these cases people didn't care about. Danny and I are giving you hard evidence from Heitzig that says the media has changed people's views on criminalization and affected policy in the past.
I know, and that's
Like,
why
I feel like
I'm
that should be enough to
genuinely
present that
confused.
empirically, like based on probability, it's a lot more likely that we get this offense.
I know, and Kevin, that's why I'm confused, because we have had cases in, like,
You're not
in
answering the
June.
two different factors that make those cases different. We just answered that question.
I know, and
One,
I,
it's
I've
children,
now
and second of
addressed
all,
the
it's
3
2 million
factors that
children.
make it different, and it doesn't make sense. You tell me right now, the third factor
Do you
is
care
that
about
these,
criminals?
no,
Can you
Sam, the
Sam,
third factor is
Sam,
that you tell me these cases have wind at their back, right? So
No, no, no,
if this
no,
is
no,
true
we
for
say
criminal
the
justice,
criminal justice
why would
reform is
identical
for
cases
youth.
get 0 media?
Okay, let me explain. Like, if you really want to talk about the Opportunity Project evidence, like, it's a little late in Grand Crossfire, but I'll still address it. What it says is, like in terms of general criminal justice, people don't really care about like the racism in the system. All they care about is like freeing up space in prison. But when it comes to kids, people freak out because they don't want like their little kids behind bars. Like that really appeals to people's emotions, and that's what like links into the
So back to Marisha's question, Birchfield versus North Dakota. That was a Fourth Amendment Supreme Court case about kids. About kids.
Wait, so like what was the case?
I genuinely don't know.
Okay, well then, like saying that is not sufficient. When Danny and I outlined how this directly affects like
I googled like Fourth Amendment kids Supreme Court, and it was the first thing to come up.
Sam, I respect you a lot, but I'm
You
gonna
guys
defer
didn't
to
hear about it.
the Heitzig evidence over like your Google search.
I mean, I'm giving you like an actual court example. Like,
No, you're
this
giving me your
this
Google
is an
search
acid,
of
this
a
is an
case
acid
of
test. This is an acid test.
You
for
can't
your
use
warrants.
it as an argument because like A wasn't in any refuses, but like B, you don't even tell us what the case is about, so
Guys,
how does
all
it apply
all
to
this
these
is
routes?
an acid test for your warrants for the judges to show that when identical rulings are made,
You don't
nothing
show
is
us what
about
the
actually
Yeah,
ruling
it's
is.
very
You
important to
can't
look to the
compare
unique
it.
circumstances of the system.
How much?
46.
46. One observation, one vote. I'll do my vote. Kevin, quick observation about the media, since it was the entire focus of every single crossfire now. What we tell you from Carter is that no one cares about criminalization cases when it comes to the Supreme Court. Even if the media puts it out there, no one's watching it. It will not actually change any rationalization of discourse, even more so. If there was so much media coverage about youth criminalization now, we would be acting upon it. But what both sides agree upon, and especially Kevin and Danny, is that there's a lot of bad stuff going on right now. If people cared so much about youth justice, and the media was covering it so heavily, we would see action as a result. But we aren't. And the reason is that the media and the people don't care about youth criminalization. It's the reason why the problem has only grown in the past. Even more so, what Twist tells you is that the story has to be controversial, meaning that since no one cares about it, it's not controversial, the media won't cover it. Don't give them access to this rationalizing of discourse. Even more so, they can have it, and we still win school resource officers. They concede from Pinner that courts would mandate that school resource officers would be present for a search. What this means is it doesn't matter about the rational discourse insofar as it's the law. No amount of people saying things, no amount of Bill O'Reilly coverage will change the law. It is what it is, and officers will increase as a result of an affirmative ballot. But that does two things. First, it criminalizes students. What Nance tells you is that you are 1.83 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement for low-level offenses. Even more so, we then funnel kids into a racist juvenile justice system. The NCCD writes that 6 times more African Americans get referred to prison and 3 times more Latinos get referred to prisons for identical crimes. This only bolsters the school-to-prison pipeline. Then we infringe upon their rights. We tell you and they concede that stop and frisk searches exist in their world. They just try to mitigate it. But what we tell you from Fidela is that we're infringing upon rights and we actually risk minority lives by seeing a 90% increase in the chance of having force used against them. They tell you SROs are going up right now. We increase that rate with an affirmative ballot. They tell you it's short term, but it's not a policy, it's a tactic approach. Thus, I urge you to engage.
Jesus.
starting on their overview on school resource officers, Sam says that now they're going to increase at a faster rate because we say they're already increasing. But Danny and I keep arguing that that is what the current trend is. The trend is towards criminalization. So if they don't increase today, they'll increase next week. It's the current trend, and the only way to put a stop to things like school resource officers or things like schools turning to stop and frisk policies in the long term is by creating a rational discourse on the issue. That being said, was in Danny and my session's intention in which we talked about this rational discourse. The real debate happened on our second link where we talked about creating a rational discussion. Sam collapses on a couple of his responses. The first one he tells us is that no one cares with regards to the Supreme Court cases. Okay, a few things. First and foremost, Danny and I say that this is a compelling story as 2 million kids are being thrown behind bars every single year. Sam says, oh, but I read about one court case that people didn't care about. Like, that's not an argument. An argument is the fact that people obviously are going to care if they think America's children are being treated unjustly. But second of all, we would also contend that Heitzig, the only empirics in the round, tell you that in the past, after TLO, the media helped influence criminalization, so people caught on to this issue. We clearly have a much more probable link because we look to what happens in the past, not Sam's Google history. The next place we're winning is he tells you we should be acting on different issues, but it's not going to go through the media. We tell you first and foremost, he says that we should be acting already if the media discourse is positive. But Danny and I tell you we have to activate the media discourse. They have to have something to report on. Like Matichek tells you, if it's the courts, they'll report on their reasoning, their justification. If it's the government, they'll report on their decision calculus. You don't get the impact until you activate it on a federal level. This is the biggest impact in the round because we tell you by educating people on the issue, we can help stop the 2 million people being sent to the criminal justice system, help check back all of the policies they tell you are so bad in the long term. This is the most important argument in today's round because it's not looking at one policy, it's looking at an array of policies that criminalize children. Thank you.